Okay. Well, welcome to the research seminar. My name is Cynthia Garcia, and I'm the contractor manager for this this contract. And I would
Bienvenidos al seminario de investigación. Yo quisiera empezar diciendo a todo el mundo.
I'm going to have Julie give the instructions of them. Quiero decir bienvenidos a todos que hablan en español. Van a haber instrucciones para la traducción y Julie, la intérprete, va a dar las instrucciones en este momento para que puedan conectarse. Thank you. Thanks, Julie.
Sure. Hi, everyone. We are offering live interpretation in Spanish during this meeting. If you wish to hear Spanish interpretation, please click the interpretation button at the bottom right of your Zoom screen. You'll see a glove icon. If you're joining via Zoom smartphone, select your language by clicking More, or the three dots in the bottom right corner of your screen. Select Language Interpretation. Then choose Spanish and click Done. If you wish to hear only the interpreters and not the original, choose a language. Estamos ofreciendo interpretación en vivo en español en esta reunión. Si desea escuchar la interpretación en español, haga clic en el botón Interpretación o Interpretation en la parte inferior derecha de la pantalla Zoom. Verá un icono de globo terráqueo o mapa mundi. Si se está uniendo a través de la aplicación Zoom para smartphone, seleccione su idioma haciendo clic en More o Más o en los tres puntos en la esquina inferior derecha de la pantalla. Seleccione Language Interpretation o interpretación del idioma. Luego elija Spanish o español y haga clic en Done o listo. Si desea escuchar solo a los intérpretes, y no a los oradores originales, asegúrese de hacer clic en Mute Original Audio o silenciar audio original. Todos deben elegir un idioma. Gracias.
Thank you, Julie.
You're welcome.
Today we're inviting you all to learn about new methods to understand cumulative impacts for environmental justice programs.
Entender los impactos acumulativos de los programas de justicia medioambiental, incluyendo AB 617 y SB 763. El AB 617 y el SB 67 sobre impactos acumulativos de los desechos peligrosos. En el 2015, la legislatura de California pasó el proyecto de ley AB 617 y en el 2015.
Both laws aim to improve environmental regulations to better protect community environmental health by more systematically integrating cumulative impacts into regulatory decision-making and by enforcement activities with programs at the California Air Resources Board for AB 617 and for the Department of Toxic Substance Control for SB 673. Both AB 617 and SB 673 require developing methods for assessing cumulative impacts and integrated indicators of community vulnerability. Yes? Hello? Please mute if you're not talking. Sorry. Community vulnerability for the implementation of regulatory programs and community monitoring. This contract was developed to create capacity by building training and technical assistance of air quality monitoring under AB 617.
Entrenamiento y asistencia técnica para monitorear la calidad del aire bajo AB 617, para evaluar la participación de la comunidad en la implementación de AB 617 y para aplicar métodos noveles para derivar nuevos indicadores de impacto acumulativo en las comunidades.
The result of this contract will help to ensure better understanding of how AB 617 and SB 673 are being implemented and how these laws are benefiting environmental justice communities while also recommending improvements. I will now address logistics. This seminar is being recorded and will be made available together with slides. After each presentation, there will be a 10-minute session for questions. Please raise your hand or add your questions to the chat. At the end of the presentations, there should be time for additional questions. At this point, just in case if we have, another 100 people joining, I would like to ask Julie to give the direction for the interpretation again.
Las instrucciones para la interpretación.
Julie?
Julie.
Okay.
I'm here.
Julie's not available, so
I'm here.
For those who need interpretation in English or Spanish, oh, there's Julie.
I'm here.
Thank you.
I'm here. We are offering live
We can't
interpretation.
hear you, Julie.
Might be in the, hello. Go ahead, go ahead.
No,
No?
that's okay. I can do it, I think.
Okay.
Para los que hablan en español y necesitan traducción, van a encontrar un globo circular, cierto, terrestre, planetario, y esa es la zona para ver la interpretación. Si ustedes necesitan interpretación para presentación, por favor, diríjanse ahí y escogen el lenguaje que necesiten. Y la interpretación está en español. Gracias. Okay. Sorry about that. I just wanted to make sure that we have
Solo quería asegurarme de que teníamos a todas las
Spanish, know that this is available in Spanish as well. Now that I've done some logistics, I would like to present the three main presenters for this presentation that have been working very hard. I would like to introduce Dr. Rachel Morella Frosh, the principal investigator for this contract. She is a professor in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management and the School of Public Health at the UC Berkeley. As an environmental health scientist and epidemiologist, her research examines social determinants of environmental health among diverse communities with a focus on equality, psychosocial stress, and how these factors interact with environmental chemical exposures to produce health inequalities. Dr. Morella Frosh has also collaborated with communities and scientists to develop science policy tools to assess cumulative impacts of chemicals and non-chemical stressors to improve regulatory decision-making and advance environmental justice. The second presenter will be David Chang, is a project coordinator and currently serves as a project coordinator for Tracking California, where he works alongside other Tracking California staff to provide technical assistance to several community organizations funded by Year 1 and Year 2 of AB 617 community air grants. He has expertise in development of both youth and adult focused environmental justice and environmental science curricula. For this project, David worked with colleagues and with partners to coordinate the logistics of workshops, develop content, and facilitate different sections at each of the three workshops for this contract. Thirdly, Dr. Jonathan London is an educator, researcher, and community builder with 30 years of experience in rural community, developed participatory research and community engaged planning. His research addresses conflicts and collaboration in environmental management with a particular emphasis of environmental justice in rural communities. Jonathan holds a BA in environmental studies from Brown University, a master's degree in city and regional planning, and a PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from UC Berkeley. He is an associate professor at UC Davis in the Department of Human Ecology, Community, and Regional Development, faculty director in the Center for Regional Change, and co-director for the Community Engagement Core Environmental Health Science Center. Here's my contact information. Now, Dr. Morella Frosh will begin the seminar presentation. Thank you very much.
Can you see my slides and hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Rachel.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. We are super excited to talk about this pretty dense project. And you'll hear from each of us. This was a very broadly scoped project and collaborative contract between ARB and the Department of Toxic Substances Control, just to give you some background. The project had three kind of main elements that we will be talking about today. It was to address this issue of capacity building, training, and technical assistance to support communities that wanted to develop a community-based air quality monitoring under AB 617, and that was led by Paul English, and David Chang is going to be talking about that. A community engaged evaluation of AB 617 implementation. And the last part was a data-driven piece where we were looking at data sources and ways in which we could apply new methods to look at geographic indicators
geográficos de impacto acumulativo y vulnerabilidad de la comunidad que pudieran integrarse o complementar las herramientas espaciales existentes, como por ejemplo Cal EnviroScreen. O sea que son tres elementos.
Monitoring led by Tracking California, community engaged evaluation piece led by Jonathan London at UC Davis, and then looking at novel indicators and methods for expanding cumulative impacts analysis in ways that are relevant to the implementation of these two laws. And that included myself, Lara Cushing at UCLA, Manuel Pastor at USC, and Jim Sad at Occidental College. So I am going to stop sharing, and I'm going to pass the baton to David Chang, who will start us off.
Good afternoon. Hey, everybody. Can you hear me okay? And can you see the slides?
Yes, looks great.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks so much, Rachel. Hey, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the workshops that we held.
Sobre los talleres que hemos hecho en 2019. Me llamo David Chang, soy un coordinador del proyecto de Tracking California. Nosotros somos un programa de un instituto público de salud.
We're also part of a larger network funded by the Center for Disease Control called the National Environmental Health Tracking Program. So I'm going to give a little bit of background and purpose behind the workshops. So the reason why we were called to host these workshops, we actually held a workshop, I think back in 2018, at the Environmental Health Leadership Summit with Comité Cívico del Valle. We helped them set up a network of 40 particulate matter monitors. And so we really wanted to bring that experience and expertise and opportunity to work, kind of bring that experience into this work. And we were contracted to help develop 3-day-long workshops across the state with a regional focus. So the regions that were identified were Southern California, the Central Valley, and then Northern California. The purpose behind the workshops was to target community members and community-based organizations that had an interest in developing their own community air monitoring network or community air monitoring projects. So we worked with 3 different groups across the state. Some of them had a lot of experience developing a network, and some of them had more of an experience developing community air monitoring projects. So we defined a network as a collection of monitors located throughout.
Teníamos que seguir una serie de monitores que estaban establecidos en varias comunidades.
And so it's really looking at stationary networks. So we also wanted to provide participants with a roadmap that they could use to decide if a network was the right decision for them. As I just mentioned, some groups have more experience developing projects versus setting up stationary networks. We also wanted to outline different steps, decisions, personnel, financial considerations, and technical resources to get started. And we also wanted to focus at these workshops, provide an opportunity for participants to hear specifically from local community groups who had some success leading air monitor projects in the region.
En su región.
So at each of these workshops, we provided a number of resources.
Además de eso, también proporcionamos varios recursos diferentes, incluyendo la guía para desarrollar una red comunitaria del
and interpretation in Spanish, if that was what the partners requested for the participants who would be there in attendance. And we also provided a lot of worksheets in Spanish and English as well. We also, in our workshops, we also referenced specific sections of the guidebook, as well as this, the community air monitoring plan, the different 14 elements that CARB provided. So we made sure that each section aligned with what was in the guidebook and also where we could pull information from the blueprint. We tried to align the agenda to fit these different sections. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about working with community partners and deciding on the workshop format. So why did we choose to work with a community partner? As I mentioned before, we really wanted to focus on providing a local connection to participants to community-based organizations who have had experiences in air monitoring work. So we recognize that many community-based organizations continue to be leaders in conducting air monitoring and have a lot of different experiences and perspectives to share. But in this particular case, we wanted to highlight experiences with groups that had experiences setting up a network that was similar to the project that we did in Imperial, where we set up a network of 40 community air monitors. So the folks in Southern California and also in the Central Valley, they belong to a network called IVAN, Identifying Violations Affecting Neighborhoods, and they're working on setting up IVAN air networks. And the last group that we partnered with was West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project. They aren't necessarily working on air monitoring networks per se, but they have had a lot of experience leading air monitoring projects. So we really wanted to connect participants with community-based organization that was really knowledgeable about local air quality issues, and could also provide information on working with air districts, and be a good starting point if participants had questions on who to connect to and that sort of thing. So what was the specific role that each community partner had? Each partner was responsible for planning and reviewing the workshop curriculum, setting the agenda, making sure that materials were okay. They were also involved in outreach and recruitment of the participants who would be attending and the guest speakers. We also asked them to co-facilitate workshops and assist with local logistics, so arranging meeting space, refreshments, and providing translation if that was needed. So what was the process that we went through to identify what needed to happen at the workshops? So initially we provided a survey to each of the community partners to try and figure out who was going to be the target audience, if each group wanted to have a similar format or if they wanted to have a completely separate format. We wanted to identify what were the core content areas, if there needed to be breakout groups, or if there were specific topics that each community partner wanted to present on. Then we held monthly calls with each partner, collectively as a group with the 3 different partners to try and identify similarities, overlapping lessons learned, and any insights that would help as co-facilitators. Leading up to each of the workshops, we had weekly calls with the community partner to coordinate logistics, identify the guest speakers, and tailor agendas and materials to their specific workshop. And then the day of the workshop, we co-facilitated alongside the community partner and also with Comité Cívico de Valle, who really provided insight on their experience setting up the Imperial air monitoring network with the 40 monitors. This is a sample agenda of one of the workshops. This was a workshop in Fresno. So here you'll see all of the different topics that we talked about. One main difference is the panels. So each group, they identified whether or not they wanted to have a panel in Oakland in the workshop in West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, for example. They had multiple panels, right, where they talked about their experience with partnering agreements, and then also with different groups like ACLIMA and with Environmental Defense Fund, EPA, to set up their air monitoring projects. So that was a little bit different in terms of format. So this is just an overview of what we did. These are the 3 workshops that we held in Southern California. We worked with a group, Casa Familiar in San Diego. In the Central Valley, we worked with Central California Environmental Justice Network, and then in Northern California, we worked with West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project. So going into the evaluations, a majority of participants found that the sessions that we provided were helpful and that new content was useful in what they were starting to do. There were some participants who attended who were part of a larger steering committee in the Imperial Air Monitoring Project, so they already had previous experience in the topic area and felt like some of the information was repetitive. But for the most part, participants who attended who weren't part of a previous project or were new to community air monitoring, they found the information really helpful. And in West Oakland, we received fewer participant evaluations, only 8 of 35 participants. So we thought it was difficult to make any conclusions, but just hearing, we did a round robin activity at the very end of the workshop where we went around and asked everybody to provide reflections and how they felt. And people found the most useful component of that workshop was learning about the partnership agreements that West Oakland had with the Bay Area Air Quality District. And there were also overlapping suggestions on ways to improve. So folks thought that we could provide more breaks and interactive hands-on activities and more time for panels. These are just some quotations, reflections from the different workshops that we had. So again, as I mentioned earlier, folks thought that it was a lot of good in-depth information. There were really detailed presentations. It was helpful getting to hear from different speakers, but a lot of it could have been split up into, different sessions. Yeah, folks thought that it was helpful information that they could bring back to their own neighborhoods and projects. So there was definitely some challenges that we encountered when hosting these workshops. In the Northern California workshop, there was a disagreement between a participant and one of our co-facilitators. So that was a bit of a challenge, and we also recognize that the projects that West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project have been involved in are very different from the other projects in San Ysidro and in the Central Valley, where they're setting up a network. And so trying to provide a path for how participants could be involved in setting up a project, there are some differences there. This workshop in Northern California particularly focused on really setting up partnership agreements and making sure that was in place. Whereas the other workshops really focused on what you might need from a community steering committee and more just different aspects of the planning process that are involved in setting up a network. Also, because these workshops had a regional focus, I think a lot of it was challenging for some of our partners to recruit members beyond their scope. So for example, in San Ysidro, because these workshops had a regional focus and needed to be inclusive to folks from Los Angeles and from Riverside, sometimes it was a bit challenging for our partners to recruit from those areas. So we tapped into resources from Comité Cívico de Valle and also from CARB to help with recruitment and identifying participants to attend. And also there were some limitations in travel funds for those who needed to come to travel longer distances. Also, as I mentioned before, these were day-long workshops, but a lot of times we think that they could have, for future workshops that are being held, could be made into a multiple-day workshop or even virtual workshops. Some considerations for those who are planning workshops in the future with partners. Just have clear processes and agreements to prevent disagreements between participants and co-hosts. Maybe include more workshops across the state so additional participants can attend or host virtual workshops so that we can reach a broader audience. Budget for partners to be involved at an early stage in the project planning, and budgeting enough for participants who also travel, far distances. And I think a lot of participants, as they noted in their evaluations, wanted more hands-on activities and more opportunities to interact with each other and also with the hosts, with the co-facilitators that were involved as well. So these are my last few slides. So through these workshops, we were able to accomplish what we wanted in terms of providing new information and increasing knowledge of how to start a community error monitoring network. And also a community error monitoring project. So workshops can be an initial step to supporting communities starting projects, but there are other ways that communities might need support, right, in their efforts. So ongoing technical assistance, funding for error monitoring, access to reference instrumentation, support with air district interactions, right? So in our workshops, we thought it was, a good start for folks to learn about partnership agreements, but, building on that relationship with the air districts might be another workshop topic, for example, to go into. Mapping regulatory monitors for co-location purposes and transparency around processes. Some groups that we're currently working with have identified wanting an inventory or a list of, where monitors are located throughout the state that could be used for co-location. Ensuring quality of control of data. Some folks thought that we really didn't get into this deeply, the quality control and quality assurance piece on the data and how to use the data. So they wanted more information on that. And I think, these are similar recommendations. Other participants felt like we could have, done a workshop completely in Spanish as well. Maybe that would be another opportunity to engage residents in error monitoring, and providing a list of community error monitoring projects, contact information for folks that they could reach out to, learning more about how do you access the data and air quality sources. Other considerations or topics, hands-on workshops on using monitoring equipment and building custom monitors. So in our workshop, we only had about 45 minutes for a demonstration during lunch around the monitor that we used in Imperial. So I think folks wanted more of a hands-on workshop on learning how to build a monitor. And again, just learning more about quality assurance, quality control procedures, and how do you interpret the data, how to outreach to monitor hosts, particularly schools, since a lot of folks are working with schools to set up monitors there. And then also different groups that are working with youth, how do you engage them in monitoring projects as well? And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, David. And now this is the 10-minute portion of the seminar. So if you have any questions.
Seminario, si tienen alguna pregunta, por favor levante su mano o las podemos leer en el.
Let me see, do I see any hands raised? No. And let me look at the chat here. I don't see any questions. New message. Is there a link in the guide to how to build a monitor?
In the guidebook, I don't know if there's a link, but I know our partners at Comité Cívico del Valle, they've put together a technical manual with specific instructions. And they've also put together some YouTube videos on how to build a box that they've used, which includes the Dilo sensor and an Arduino board. And they have a lot of instructions on how to set up that monitor in particular.
Thank you. We have another
Gracias.
question here.
Tenemos otra pregunta.
I noticed you didn't have any
Me
discussion
fijé que no
on
había ninguna conversación sobre involucrar a los científicos
I would say so a lot
o
of our
investigación. Bastante de nuestra investigación viene sobre los y como también de aliados con la Universidad de Washington y también trabajamos con las personas o investigadores de protocolos de cómo hacer una red. Ahora estamos proveyendo consultaciones con grupos que están siendo fundados por los de 617 y lo Carbline que está basado en Seattle y ellos proveen bastante consultación en cuanto a calibración, analizar los datos, problemas de los monitores y todo eso.
Okay, so I see that there's a hand, Matt.
Veo que también hay una mano levantada.
If you could go ahead, Matt.
Matt, si gusta continuar con su pregunta. Sí, gracias. David, gracias. Me da gusto saber que están trabajando sobre asistencia técnica en estas comunidades. ¿Tienen los distritos del aire regionales en esa área como parte de eso? Porque como grupos para establecer que sean parte de este proceso o en cualquier otro proceso. No sé. Entramos de bastante resistencia cuando traer a diferentes investigaciones de fuera y tener el diálogo. Si esto está cambiando el diálogo al nivel local.
So I guess for one of the projects that
Para
I'm
uno de los proyectos en el que estoy involucrado actualmente, yo sé que un distrito tiene de estar colaborando con el monitoreo y es un proceso. No puedo hablar yo de alguno de los otros proyectos. Puede que haya más resistencia, no estoy seguro, pero creo que tener procesos en plano para trabajar con ellos ayuda, sobre todo en proyectos como este, es de mucha ayuda. Sí. Y también es para que nos tomó 14 meses para tener permiso para poder ir al área del estado en San Pablo y eso fue mucho tiempo que no teníamos y aún no teníamos seguridad de poder hacerlo esto en Stockton o 617 en esa área. Hay mucha razón para esto, pero no vi en los beneficios de monitoreo. Es de que yo no soy un regulador. Yo puedo dar a la gente datos preliminares y usar un principio de precaución y hacerlo en caso de, pero no necesito 3 meses de AQS de que a lo mejor no vamos a tener receso esta mañana. Entonces, hay una razón por la cual el monitoreo de la comunidad, del aire en la comunidad debe ser más flexible que el monitoreo regulatorio regional, porque aún sí, siempre terminamos en lo correcto de todas maneras, pero me gustaría poder comunicar eso y también con los miembros de la comunidad en vez de preocuparnos de que se nos demande por comunicar algo incorrecto, ¿verdad?
Thank you. We have a couple more questions in the
Tenemos
chat.
un par de preguntas en el chat.
Could you talk a little bit
¿Podría
about
hablar un poquito sobre cómo reclutaron para los talleres para que se asegurara que hubiera representación por varias áreas de la comunidad? Por ejemplo,
Yeah, so we really relied.
sí, en realidad dependimos en la comunidad, con los socios de la comunidad con los que estamos trabajando, porque en California básicamente estamos basados en el Valle de la Bahía, pero como no estamos en nuestras áreas en las que ellos trabajan, dependemos bastante de nuestros socios en la comunidad. Trabajamos con ellos de que algunos grupos que teníamos identificados que podrían ser participantes y mencionamos eso, pero creo que dependimos en ellos para que nos ayudaran a poder reclutar y con los estipendios y ver quién podría atender. En el taller en San Isidro,
There were some challenges there.
algunos retos ahí en cuanto a reclutamiento, pero creo que
some challenges reaching out.
Enfrentamos unos desafíos también en Los Ángeles y en Riverside, entonces traímos al Comité Cívico del Valle y ellos reclutaron a algunos participantes del Valle Imperial y tuvimos alguna ayuda para poder identificar en el área de Los Ángeles, en Riverside también, que pudieran atender. No sé si eso contestaba su pregunta.
I hope so.
Yes, thanks.
Espero que sí. Sí, gracias.
Do you have another question? They just want a
Tengo
clarification.
una pregunta de qué clarificación cuando usted mencionó PM, el PM 2.5. Los redes que usamos o que estamos trabajando para el proyecto de Imperial son el enfoque es PM.10 y
For the projects that we referenced with West Oakland, they were measuring other pollutants. But for the network that we talked about in the Imperial project and then also in the Central Valley, it was referencing 2.5 and PM10.
Thanks. So we have another question, which is +1 to Ronald's question. Oh, what about engaging NGOs like the Union of Concerned Scientists? So it says, what about engaging NGOs like the Union of Concerned Scientists?
You mean,
Plus-
yeah, I guess I don't think we were considering them. I guess I'm not sure. Like for future workshops, is that something that you?
I think, yeah, I don't know if Alexandra wants to go ahead and unmute herself and ask directly, but I assume it means that it, yeah, have you looked at in, I assume future, yeah, at this point.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, if these organizations are interested in doing air monitoring work, I think, you know, we could I think for future workshops, you definitely want to include a wider pool, but for our particular workshops, I think we, again, speaking to the recruitment piece, we relied on folks that were interested in air monitoring or folks that were just getting ready to start a community air monitoring project, and those were the target audiences for these workshops, at least.
I'm not sure this is a question. Do we see any hands? Yeah, we have a hand. Let's go ahead. Oh no, that's not a hand, sorry. It says here, Ginger mentions, I used to work in volunteer water quality monitoring. If you want to share with regulators, you want to have strong QA and QC, but Matt's, that's a good point. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think there's some communication among people, so we're gonna skip that one. And unless, Ginger, you want to clarify. No. It says, yeah, the data always matches up.
Oh, this is Ginger. Yeah, just Matt's thing about it's always good to just share information and educate people, and just, you know, educating people has its own value. But there was actually a great story in the at an EPA water quality monitoring conference where something went to court and the state regulator was saying, well, you know, this is just volunteer data. And the judge asked when the last time the regulator had calibrated their equipment, and they couldn't answer the question. And it was proven that actually the volunteers were using better quality controls, and the judge asked the agency to include the data from the volunteers. So it's just something that, you know, I think that's a great trick if people want to engage the regulators and the regulators are hesitant, is if you do have good QA/QC, they should take the data. So.
Thank you, Ginger. And then, and Matt, I think confirms that. So that's great. We reached the 10-minute point for questions and answers, and there will be an opportunity to continue to asking Dave for more questions and the general group on other matters. So I'm going to, at this point, stop the questions and answers and hand it over to Jonathan.
Great. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for your support all throughout the project, California Resources Board throughout. And I also do want to mention the team that I worked with, Peter Nguyen, and Mia Dawson and Katrina Manrique throughout the project. So the purpose of our evaluation of the AB 617 process was to assess the challenges and opportunities and lessons learned from the community engagement process to assist CARB, air districts, community steering committees, and other stakeholders to improve the future implementation of 617, and then ultimately to share the lessons learned about AB 617 with wider audiences, because as goes California, so goes the nation. In terms of the methods of how we collected this kind of information, we did a range of surveys, 2 different rounds of all the different stakeholders involved in implementation process. Those were both in English and Spanish. We did interviews, about 66 of those throughout all of the 10 initial sites. And I guess I should back up and say, this is all the first year, the 10 initial sites. Although, as you know, the process has gone forward. This all happened within the first implementation year. These were done by in-person and by phone, and went through winter of 2020. We also did participant observation of all of the 10 community steering committees. Sorry, that is my dog in the background. In terms of the limitations, this was a formative or process-based evaluation, meaning that we were looking at the process, and it was sort of a snapshot in time. And I'll describe a little bit more about the timing of that, but it was not summative. This is an ongoing process, and we were looking, at a particular slice of it. In particular, this evaluation happened largely before the final SERP adoptions, so it doesn't include much of the actual documents. It looks at the process leading up to the documents. Our survey response was modest, about 25%. We were dependent on the air districts for distribution. We didn't have direct access, so didn't have quite as many as we would have liked. As I mentioned, we didn't do a technical assessment of the SERPs, and we didn't evaluate either the air grants or the Tracking California air quality monitoring process that David was talking about. They evaluated themselves quite well. So in terms of the overview, what's the takeaway that I really want you to be drawing from today? So first off, we found that AB 617 is a bold but incomplete experiment in environmental justice, looking at 2 key dimensions of EJ, both focusing on the most overburdened places and also honoring local power and voice. The results, because this is an experiment, the results have been uneven, with some successes in developing community-informed clean air plans, but problems in the process, particularly power sharing between the communities and the air districts, and impacts. What have been the value-added actions is a real question that a number of people have. Lessons learned follow from those experiences. There's a need for improved power sharing with the community, more aggressive, measurable, and enforceable actions, and a more explicit racial justice framework or approach. And so finally, we found that the question of, well, will AB 617 live up to its build potential as transformative in air quality management? That is an open and critical question. So to summarize the findings, and I'll go into more depth in a number of these in a moment, The blueprint that David mentioned, which is sort of the constitutional document for the implementation of 617, it's impressive. It lays out a robust framework for the implementation across all of the different sites, but it is not detailed enough. According to many respondents, doesn't provide enough guidance, particularly around community engagement, doesn't have that kind of really strong environmental justice or racial justice framework, and doesn't really serve as a backstop that the community groups can use to ensure accountability from the air districts. The consultation group of leaders from the environmental justice, the air districts, agencies, and some researchers, that has provided a really important dialogue space for the development first of the blueprint and then ongoing implementation. There has been some, particularly early on, lack of clarity about the purpose of the group. And because it is such a diverse group, sometimes the guidance back to CARB of what they should be doing was somewhat less than decisive. The community selection process was on one measure successful. It got these initial 10 pilots into some of the most overburdened communities in the state. And there were a number of innovations in the selection process, and I'll get to those in a moment. At the same time, there was a lot of perceived competition between communities, and that really cuts against the whole solidarity in the environmental justice and any sort of social justice, racial justice movement, which is an unfortunate dynamic. There was also a lot of variation between communities where places where the communities were really leading in the proposal of sites and some that were really district run. And again, I'll get to more of that on all those points in a moment. So the real central piece of the process that we observed is the community steering committees, or CSCs. So there were, again, a number of successes and challenges. So in terms of the success, there was a great amount of diversity within these CSCs across all of these different domains. Maybe not surprisingly, there was also a lot of conflict within the CSCs, particularly early on when they were deciding about decision-making processes, some around membership, some questions about disclosure of industry affiliations, and also the sort of appropriate roles and decision-making authorities that industry members should have. There was a significant amount early on, and in some of the locations continuing, conflict between the community and advocacy members of the CSCs and the air district, particularly over how much voice and authority the former should have. Few of the CSCs had facilitators in the beginning. Almost all had them by the end. This was mostly a great assistance, although there was some unevenness in the effectiveness of those in some cases. There was a fair bit of language access, particularly for Spanish speakers, some for other language speakers, but continued issues of some of the non-dominant English speakers feeling less than fully engaged in the process. One of the tremendous innovations was that community groups, more so than the districts, more so than CARB, really stepped up in a number of the sites to do community resident-based capacity building to make sure that there was really meaningful and impactful community engagement. And it took a lot of time and a lot of creativity, but it really paid off in the community engagement being so impactful based on this sort of capacity building. But it took a lot. There was also a lot of concern early on, in some cases continued, with the level of complexity of the presentations coming from air districts, some from CARB, from outside consultants, that it really wasn't well matched with the level of technical capacity of a number of the CSC members, particularly residents, and a real need to improve those presentations to make sure that they truly are effective, thinking about science communications here. There was some concern at different points about the question of, can there be meetings outside of the CSC meetings? Some of the CSC or districts in this that were running CSEs held the position that those were not permissible, and other places very much encouraged them. In terms of the camps, the community air monitoring plans, so these were designed by the districts to be able to gather data to ideally inform the air protection plans, SERPs, which I'll talk about in a second. There was a lot of interest, and David's presentation really shows that, a lot of grassroots interest in community monitoring, but also some of the monitoring presentations, as I mentioned, were perhaps over technical. The monitoring didn't always address all the issues that community groups wanted and in all the places that they wanted. And there was a major problem with time of getting enough time for camp data to inform the SERPs. In terms of the SERPs, these sort of action plans for cleaning the air, there were a number of community priorities incorporated in those in a number of the places, looking at land use, mobile sources, ports, pesticides, but there was a lot of question about how many of those and to what degree were those community priorities fully incorporated in the SERPs. We found that CARB played a really important role in a sort of a navigation, negotiation, mediation function to encourage the air districts to incorporate more of that community-based input and priorities. There's been more participation by other agencies, Department of Pesticide Regulation, cities and counties, but also some real challenges of bringing those together, these new institutions. Public health, this is CARB focusing on public health, air districts being public health agencies in the ideal sense. But I think a lot of progress to go to really put public health more deeply as a fundamental basis of the SERPs. The community air grants, we didn't look in depth at those. There was a lot of support for those, some interest in seeing those go more to grassroots groups. And in terms of overall environmental justice, a strong emphasis on environmental justice in the blueprint and in the legislation, some of the CSEs, but people finding that it wasn't as fully integrated as it could be. Okay, so now let's look at some of the details here. So we looked at community engagement across all of these different domains that we mentioned, particularly about who is setting the agenda and facilitating the meetings, who is deciding about the membership, the process, the boundary setting, camp activities, SERP activities, budget allocations, and others. And we put the 10 sites on a continuum from very district-led to community-led. And you can see how these are arrayed across that continuum. Some of these things shifted over time. I'm sure that if we did this analysis now, you would see some differences as well. But this is what it looked like at the time of our research. From a much more district level led efforts, for example, in the San Diego Portside area at South Sac, and ranging sort of in the middle, and then Imperial County and West Oakland being the most community-led. And there's a number of reasons for that, which I can get into a little bit now and more in the Q&A. So in terms of the CSE process, we kind of see an interesting division or tension between community and air district perspectives. So from the community perspective, this was sort of an illustrative quote from one community resident, really using this language of environmental justice. We need to speak for ourselves. We don't need prescribed solutions. And this is where they came in, and this is where they really were based. But they were met with a different kind of message from the districts, often of saying, well, we'll give you the voice that you need. We'll tell you what you need. And that really struck a conflictual chord. Some of that you can understand hearing the voices or the voice here of one air district personnel, one of the regional air districts, that talked about really seeing the AB 617 CSC, while it thought that it had full authority to explore, identify, and implement solutions. In fact, this person says they need to be more clearly understood. The district is ultimately, we have to take to our board the SERP they, meaning the board, is the one who approves the SERP, and CARB ultimately approves the SERP. It's not the SC, it's not the steering committee. They are more of an advisory role. So you have this, we speak for ourselves, and we have this, you're an advisory role. And those things do not mesh well. And that really has been the substance of significant conflict all throughout the process. And through our observation in another project, we see that that is continuing today in many places. A couple of the key populations that sometimes are a bit off the radar screen. Youth have been important in a number of the sites, but there's also been a problem of follow through and consistent support for the young people to make sure that they're really playing and they feel like they're being respected and incorporated. And sometimes that hasn't happened. Sometimes with the non-English speakers, there's been an issue, this from a Latina, Spanish-speaking Latina, talking about some sense of marginalization that she experienced in the CSC. As I say, this has really improved over time in most of the CSCs, partly having the facilitators playing a role and partly just sort of a learning process overall. This is a nice summary from one of the facilitators talking about sort of their ideal CSC process. And I think it serves as a nice model. So there's a co-designing and co-leading, there's transparency, there's acknowledging mistakes and learning curves, there's paid stipends. And I should say this was something that came out at our, we held a statewide convening in February 2019, and it came out that only some of the air districts were paying community stipends and others weren't. That caused significant concern, and that now has been rectified for the most part across the board. In terms of the blueprint, our sense was sort of variable satisfaction. So what do we mean by that? If you look at this graph, you see on the far left, very unsatisfied and somewhat unsatisfied, and in the middle, somewhat satisfied and very satisfied. So you can see that there's a good number of responses in the somewhat unsatisfied. Air districts, 50% of those being in the somewhat unsatisfied with the blueprint, but a mix of the other categories as well. Still the majority in the somewhat satisfied and very satisfied categories, but we really need to understand what some of that variation is. So again, we're going to have two different perspectives, one from the regional air district, kind of a critique that it's seen as too rigid and too kind of cookie cutter, one size fits all. It has burdensome requirements on air districts with little community benefit, and we should really be looking at, according to this person, other elements from the SERPs and camps that could be improved. On the other hand, you have a community organization that says it's too vague and it needs to be much more in depth. Instead of saying to consider and guide, it should be shall, should, must. And it shouldn't be left as much up to individual interpretation. There needs to be more clarity. So again, some really interesting tensions there. In terms of the camps, we see here in this table, from very unsatisfied at the top, going down to very satisfied in the bottom, according to these different stakeholder groups, community residents, and so on. Somewhat unsatisfied, 50% of environmental justice organizations were unsatisfied, 25% of CARB are somewhat, and 25 unsatisfied. So 50% unsatisfied. Small sample size here, just 4. So really important to take that into account. So in terms of qualitative responses, one thing that we did really hear across the board was a lot of concern about timing, and just this sort of legislatively set timeline of how quick these camps needed to be put into place and the SERPs needing to be implemented. There just wasn't enough time for the camp data to be informing the SERPs. Now it can, over time, be setting a baseline that can be used to track progress, but in terms of that first year, it was really difficult. And this quote says that it was a total mistake in terms of the timeline that they created. So moving on to the SERPs, again, this sort of table, the different questions now, and then level of satisfaction across the columns. So if we look at the very unsatisfied, not too bad, 4 to 6.
De hecho, no tanto, 4 a 6%, un poquito.
The board, 14 to 18%, good in the middle, and about 50 to 60% of the stakeholders were satisfied or very satisfied. So, majority satisfied, but some significant concerns at the same time. So just a couple quotes on this. In the draft SERP period, we heard a number of comments that the SERPs really focused a lot on education and outreach enforcement as well. But it also, this person says, from a community organization, must be matched with clear emission reduction goals and health outcome targets. So really, let's keep our eye on the prize. How is AB 617 really improving air quality, really improving health quality? And the question is open. This is an open question and needs to be tracked over time to see if this is in fact the case. There were a number of really positive reactions to some of the final SERPs. So some came on pretty early on in the schedule. So we were able to track a couple of them, including in the Central Valley. So one community organization said that, there were some positive changes. Can and will they make changes? We hope so. There's still some stuff we want to tweak and improve, but if the residents walk away with justice served, I think we'd be proud of themselves, very proud of themselves. Didn't get everything we wanted, but we got a lot of what they asked for from the beginning. So some satisfaction there. Again, question is implementation. How will these actually hit the ground? That's an open question. In terms of the views on CARB, so this was a really bold experiment for CARB to engage in regional air management in a much more hands-on way. And yet, there was a lot more call for additional proactive engagement. So from one community organization, they were concerned that too much was being delegated to the air districts. And in fact, they wanted to have CARB not sitting in the back of the room, but really coming forward and playing a more active and more forward role. From a facilitator, who's really kind of hands are in there, had somewhat of a similar perspective. Really, not satisfied with CARB sitting in the audience. Maybe answering questions when they're asked, maybe presenting here and there. But this person is saying they need to be doing more. They need to have more proactivity. The staff needs to be more proactive and maybe even have different staff or more staff who have the capacities to do that kind of community engagement. So I think this is a real lesson learned for CARB, and I think that lesson learned, as I understand it, is being in fact learned. But this was something that came up strongly in the period of our evaluation. So in terms of overall assessment, so we found all of those critiques notwithstanding, some significant support, some optimism. Again, whether that's will be borne out in fact remains to be seen. But as you can see here, we broke this down again, very unsatisfied to very satisfied, and this was broken out by stakeholders, community residents, so on. So you could see, between 5% in terms of industry, very unsatisfied, to 10% or so with community residents and air districts. Industry, almost 30%, somewhat unsatisfied. Good bit in the middle, kind of holding a question there. Not quite satisfied, not quite unsatisfied. Good number of somewhat satisfied. Up over 50%, in the case of EJ organizations. Again, only 15 here, so we really need to, hold this with a caveat about low numbers, but a pattern nonetheless. In terms of now stepping back even further, the factors that facilitate and challenge success. So there's a real difference, of course, across this state, this amazingly diverse state, and these 10 sites, which now have only continue that diversity in the 15 sites that we have now on board. So it's really clear that a cookie cutter approach won't work. The issues are different in place to place, the populations are different, the history is different, the larger politics are different. So we really need to have this ability to be customized. There's significant variation in historical relationships. I showed the continuum there with particularly West Oakland being the most community-led. To some degree, significant degree really, the success is not a 617 success. The success is a 2-decade success in West Oakland of a very long-standing, hard to develop, but very important history of collaboration, which then found its expression in 617. Similarly, in other places, San Joaquin Valley, Imperial, with longstanding conflicts, those conflicts continued in 617. Some of those were exacerbated, made worse by 617. But you can't blame just the 617 process. These are longer historical pieces, and the process really needs to take that kind of history into account. History matters. Power of industry as one of those factors as well. The capacities really varied across the districts, within CARB as well, residents and advocates to some degree as well. And so there was a lot of difference in some cases in sort of cultural capacity, cultural humility, the ability to work with structural racism. And that's growing, particularly in CARB, that's growing to a significant degree. There's a lot of variation in resident technical capacity. Matt Holmes was saying, there's been a move to having these technical advisory groups. That's a real innovation, really important to be able to support that technical capacity so people can engage in a meaningful way. The community engagement and decision-making power, that varied, as I say, across that continuum. And sometimes there really was a mismatch between sort of the professed ideals of 617 and what was really happening in the room. And so that's going to, if the legislation is really going to be a success, these kinds of factors will need to be addressed. Another sort of variation on that is looking at the different leadership models. There has been a shift, and as we're tracking it on another project, a greater shift from district-led to at least co-hosted in a number of places that were more district-led, but a general need to move towards that community-led side of the continuum. The timeline has been challenged. Everyone's been pushed back to the wall. CARB's back is to the wall, dealing with the legislative timelines. It doesn't have the capacity to change those necessarily. Air districts, they're dealing with those pressures. The CSEs are dealing with those pressures. Very difficult to deal with that, coupled with the need to sort of go slow, build relationships, build trust. Those things are really in tension with each other. Again, role of CARB, I already mentioned this, the call for more proactive engagement. And then the need for the blueprint to be revised, and good news, it is significantly being revised right now. At the time, there was a lot of critique of it not being sufficient. So in terms of recommendations, this was, again, coming to the end of year one, so we're recommending the consultation group should be continued, revising the blueprint. In fact, that is happening, and there's a people's blueprint process addressing many of the deficiencies that we noted and members of the consultation group noted over time. The community selection process, that issue of competition, that issue of being able to provide these resources to the dozens, say hundreds of communities that are facing these kinds of issues. And the fact is there's just 15 communities in 3 years. There's quite a mismatch between what's being provided and what's being needed. How can that community selection process be improved? How can things be perhaps piloted in these 15 sites and then spread? Really thinking about this as a learning lab that can then develop innovations that can be applied in other places. The CSE processes, as I've mentioned before, a real need for trust building, for cultural capacity, for dealing with issues of structural racism, of a way of ensuring that community priorities find their way into the SERPs and now SERP implementation process. The camps really a question of timing. Just for my timing, I'm going to keep going here, not go into more detail on that. The SERPs themselves, again, making sure that these are added value above and beyond what the districts are already doing, that they're going to be measurable, that they're going to be enforceable, and they're going to be significant. And that was certainly the intention. That's the game or the goal that everyone is moving towards. And the question is, how well is that actually going to take place? Funding, critical. We can't do it without it. CARB, there's a lot of requests for funds, and funds need to be provided. Fortunately, it seems that that is happening with the current budgets. But that for this to be sustainable, it can't be it can't be a one-time, it can't be a short-term, needs to be a long-term investment. So just a couple of considerations for CARB itself, long-term. Thinking about how can it manage a statewide process, a statewide mandate with place-based processes. How can CARB build its own capacity to take on these new roles? How can CARB uphold these values of environmental and racial justice? Thinking about training, thinking about the civil rights framework using Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. There's been some real innovation on that. And then finally, some questions for the future. How can CARB, how can the legislature, how can the districts and the CSCs assess their long-term interests? Here are some questions to consider. So how can the camps and SERPs actually translate into the action of the air districts? How can work of the air districts integrate into all of this sort of complex ecology network of all these other institutions, school districts, cities, counties, transportation districts, ports? All of these entities need to be part of this implementation process, and that's a heavy lift. How can this change the relationships between community organizations and air districts that have been so conflictual? How is this going to be changing the relationships between CARB and the air districts? Is it really improving air quality and health in these communities? And finally, how well are the stakeholders using the lessons learned to improve over time? And now finally, how does this vary across the 15 sites and as we go forward into implementation into future years? So that's that. I'll stop there for questions. Apologies about going a little bit quickly, but I look forward to hearing your questions and discussion.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was a great presentation. So I have a couple questions on the chat that I'm going to start out with. Let's see. So what guidance can you give for building a strong racial equity component to your program blueprints? Or would you would suggest?
Yeah, it's a great question and a really needs a big and long answer. So a couple of things. So first off is really recognizing the structures of racism. So for example, thinking about air quality improvements are going to require a treatment of land use. Land use is a reflection of 100 years of structurally racist decisions about who can live where are noxious facilities being located, what are transportation routes, how are highways arranged and aligned. All of these have over decades disadvantaged in a systematic way communities of color and low-income communities. So though that kind of understanding needs to be brought into the planning process. It can't be seen as sort of a coincidence or maybe just something that is out there, but it needs to be at the center. How do we address those kinds of legacies? Also a bit more on the micro side, there's dealing with those questions of how do we deal with structural racism in the room? How do we deal with these in terms of our interactions with each other, or I should say, with the interactions of people, say, on and within the CSE, between the CSE and air districts, with CARB? I should really strongly, and I will strongly praise CARB for taking racial equity on as a core value. It shows up in the triennial research plan. There's strong working groups. I think that's a great model. for other entities to use. I think air districts could really benefit from taking some of that advice as well. So probably that's all the time I have to say, but think macro and think micro.
Okay, we have a hand, so Mrs. Marguerite? If you can unmute yourself. Maybe I have to.
There you go.
There you go.
There's a couple things, and I put it in the chat, that a lot still, your study covers a lot of stuff. It should be happening, but there's a few more things that should be happening. One is that every department who wants to use AB 617 are clueless about environmental justice, community engagement. They're just totally just clueless. But they're doing these studies, about community and using the baselines of environmental justice. This has been my experience I had last week with the Office of Research for CARB. We got universities and other folks who want to bring people on board who have not had the real orientation or training. And another last thing too is that there's not a space and timeline prior to you being nominated as either air monitor and time for you to be the time that you're nominated to be doing air monitor to prepare for readiness. And when I say for readiness, to be looking at all these things that you have developed this checklist for has not been applied or mixed in moving forward. And I see that there are going to be more complications until we have much more built-in processes so people can start connecting the dots and closing the gaps. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Brilliant as always. Thanks, Ms. Margaret.
Okay. So we have Sam says here, appreciate the shout from Alexander. No, this is, of the last QAQCs, isn't an expert in the QAQ monitor. I think we'll skip that one. That's more of a David question. This was great research project, Dr. London. It's very honest and presents many perspectives. So that was kudos. Have these results been published for us to read yet? And I'll answer that one. Yes. These results we have a final draft. I've put a link for everybody to see. There's Jonathan's portion of it is there. We need to put the rest of the draft, and we're making sure that it's ADA compliant before we can put it up. We had put Jonathan's portion a little bit before because it had been final and there was a request for it. And so for the entire contract final report, we have that one and we'll be putting it soon and we'll be sending it out together with the recording, link of the recording of this seminar. Thank you. And then,
sorry, Cynthia, maybe to go to the hands, if that's okay.
Yes.
I just see Deldy's got her hand up, and
I didn't see a hand.
yeah, Deldy and Matt.
Okay, please, Deldy.
Hi, Matt. You're welcome to go ahead of me. Go ahead.
Oh, can you hear me? Okay, I was just going to back up Ms. Margaret about the sort of the community phase at the very early part of all of this and how important it is. And that it's very much been presented in that way in communities, only to have it change midway through the process or when you got to a friction point. And so that's the kind of stuff that has really undermined trust, at least in the two communities I've worked in. is sort of, the poetry of the legislation, and then sort of the sausage making of the implementation has really been off-putting for some of us. And I think, the report points to some of this, but I just want to highlight that communication across communities is vital. So Ginger asked if we've all gotten together, and the answer, to my knowledge, is not really. Certainly in the Central Valley, we have coordinating entities that are pulling us together, and we're absolutely helping to set up new communities with more knowledge so they're more ready to go as their 617 process starts. But no, we don't really have a formal, hey, welcome to the AB 617 family orientation that I know Ms. Margaret and people like Kevin Hamilton have advocated for before. We should be getting a community leadership bump from people who have been through this before when we start off the process. And by the same token, the agencies should be talking to each other too. They're being asked to tackle regulatory areas that are new to them. When you got a stationary source air district and they've got money to spend on a new mobile sources category that they don't have any history with, like a port or certain mobile vehicles, why would they know how to do that? They should be talking to other districts and other CARB entities that have already tackled those problems. And unfortunately, we're all kind of learning out loud, both at the community level and at the district level. And it's made it very difficult. I wish the percentages of satisfied were much higher. I'm not satisfied to just split it at 51%. I think I've said enough. I'll let you go, Delby. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to say, as the Director for the Office of Community Air Protection, and just how grateful I am to you, Dr. London, and to the entire team, and to Rachel, and as the principal investigator, but all the other members of the research team for the work you've done to really help illuminate this connection to our programs and environmental justice. The evaluation, Dr. London, I think was super helpful. I continue to go to it for inspiration and ideas. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about one of the recommendations you had on your screen, where you talked about the consultation group and the idea of really broadening the charge. Would you say that in your mind that also would go to considering this really overarching challenge that we have with this program, which is how can we help communities and assist communities in a way that goes beyond the current model?
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you, Deldy. Thanks for the kind words. Well, I'd say a couple things. So one is, again, because this was a point in time recommendation about, continuing the consultation group and expanding to some degree, that has happened, or it has happened. The consultation group has continued, and it does have this really important charge of significantly revising and expanding the blueprint that really can hold a lot of the different kind of recommendations that I've made here, a lot of the ones that as Ms. Margaret made and Matt as well. In terms of the charge, I think there's a number of different pieces here, and I'll address it at the CSC level. So thinking about the ways that this network effect of all of these different kind of entities is going to be crucial for the implementation of the SERPs. Fresno, as you know, because we're on that same call, there's a new MOU with the city of Fresno. That kind of thing is going to need to be vastly increased to be able to have all of these different implementing agencies much more engaged. Challenges, as you know, in Kern County with pesticide provision in the SERP and a lot of sort of state-county tensions there. And so how can we really create this new sort of environmental justice constitution that brings in all of these different entities coordinating with each other and aligned on these values of environmental justice? And to some degree, I do encourage as the best entity in the room, CARB, to really hold a lot of that value space and to look at across all of the different elements of implementation of 617, how can these values, environmental justice, addressing structural racism, how can they really be brought to the fore in a meaningful way? So a lot more I could say on that, but maybe leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you.
Thanks. Unfortunately, we're going to have to move on to the next presentation. I just want to make a note that we have about 14 new questions regarding your presentation.
You want to take a few more questions, that's fine. It seems like this is pretty.
But I don't want to miss yours, and yours is too.
You won't miss it. Why don't you just take a couple more?
Okay. All right. So also one thing to consider in the future, let's see, carbon other districts and local government are adhering to the SERPs. For the SERPs to be effective governments, you need to respect them. EJ proposed rail yard and Colton being 1 mile from the San Bernardino Muscoi community. So I think what they're saying is that CARB needs to be more effective. They have to respect the community's suggestions.
Yes. Right. Thank you for that. Yeah. Thank you, Christopher. I think that's a key point. I think that aligns well with the general points I'm making. I don't see a question in there, but that statement about the needing to respect respect these communities and the kinds of issues that they're dealing with: rail yards, ports, distribution centers, refineries, oil and gas, all of these different really significantly hazardous industries and sites need to be taken into account. So I think that's really important.
So Ginger has, I'll reread Marguerite's question, which I think you already addressed, but the missing links are as following: must be addressed: the racism, the budget, the oversight, the internal and external orientations, the readiness for the community, agencies, and all parties. The next question is, have the community organizations from the 15 projects ever met to communicate with each other and compare experience?
So we did have just after year one a convening. This was February of 2019, February 2020. And we had some of the year two groups in there. There hasn't been a gathering of all 15. That is something that we're looking into, because I do think that cross learning is so important.
Okay, well, with that, I would love to take the other ones, but I would like to move forward, and we'll have some time at the end. So with that, Rachel, thank you so much, Jonathan, and Rachel, I handed the presentation over to you.
Okay, can people hear and see a presentation?
Yes, yes, we can. Thank you, Rachel.
Excellent. Okay, so the last element of this project was to explore additional work that could be done to integrate indicators of relevance for cumulative impacts analysis, and also think about how we might enhance some of our methods in terms of this spatial work that needs to be done in terms of thinking about implementation of AB 617 and SB 673. So this part, we had a lot of consultation both with DTSC and CARB scientists in terms of ongoing conversations about the development of new metrics and approaches for cumulative impacts assessments. And one of the things that we agreed on was that, CalEnviroScreen is a really great tool. It is been developed with a lot of consultation across diverse stakeholders, and so that was to be foundational, and the goal there was to really think about how we could supplement results of CalEnviro-Screen through the development of additional community metrics that are not currently included, but that could be used to supplement and additionally inform decision making. And then we provided the development of some of the highlights of these statewide data layers that I'm going to talk through a little bit, of all of the novel metrics to both agencies. And also what I'm going to talk about is what we call the Diasymetric Mapping of populations, which is, this is a significant challenge, I think, in a lot of spatial EJ work, particularly when we're using geographic units like census tracts or even block groups, where particularly in rural areas, you have they're very large units, and yet you have very small number of people living within them, particularly in rural areas. And so oftentimes the default assumption is that these people are spread out within these units. And so we tried to use some of these Diasymetric mapping techniques to see if we could improve that. And then we also use this data layer to and linked it with the hazardous waste facilities that DTSC regulates, and provided those data sources. Okay, so let's start with the data source that we provided for DTSC. And this, again, was very specific to the hazardous waste facilities that they regulate. And what we tried to do was to develop a layer that defined hazardous waste facilities using polygons of the facility property area rather than just a single point, okay? And we developed two kinds of polygons, one that encompassed the entire facility boundary, and then another one that encompassed the waste-specific boundary within the facility location, okay? So basically two polygons, entire property boundary, and then within that property boundary, the area where the actual hazardous waste process or storage is occurring. Again, to allow some flexibility and to be able to look at it in different ways. And again, we also integrated that with, and I'll talk about this in more detail in a second, higher resolution population distribution data so that we could get a more clear sense of where we think people are, particularly since a lot of these hazardous waste facilities are in rural communities. We wanted to see if we could get a better sense of where people are in relationship to these facility boundaries. And after we applied Diasymetric mapping methods to better figure out where people were, then within these areas of analysis, or what we call, we call them areas of analysis, but they're basically different buffer distances from the facility polygon or the hazardous waste polygon. Can we calculate population weighted metrics after we've done a better job of figuring out where people are likely to be within these different buffer distances? So if we're trying to get a sense of what are the different risk profiles within, half a mile versus 1 mile versus 3 miles of a hazardous waste facility, we can better kind of use population weights within those buffer distances that reflect the populations within those buffers. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. So these results are available and were shared with DTSC in different spreadsheets. So our first task was to figure out the location of the hazardous waste facilities. DTSC gave us the data initially in the form of geospatial point shapefile with single points representing the approximate location of each hazardous waste facility. It contained coordinates for 82 sites. 5 were eventually omitted because they're no longer operating. So we focused on 77 that are currently in operation. And so our first task was we used hazardous waste operating permit documents And we also used parcel data to better delineate the actual facility boundaries and to determine the specific locations of where the waste activities and or storage was located. So again, trying to move from these simple kind of point estimates to actually getting a better sense of the full extent of these facilities. So in order to define those facility boundaries, we undertook several steps. First one was reviewing the operating permit documents with the maps and the figures showing where these facilities are actually located and their boundaries. And then we validated the coordinates of these hazardous waste facility point locations based on addresses and the permitting documents. And in some cases, we had to adjust incorrect locations using the permit information and the site address information. We also used Google Maps to cross-check with the permit documents before we did any of these kinds of corrections. And then in the third step, we intersected and also verified our corrected hazardous waste facility point locations with a statewide parcel data set. So, statewide parcel data can give you a good sense of property boundaries for different kinds of land uses, including these regulated entities. And so if the parcel looked to agree with the facility boundaries that were depicted in the permit information, we use this parcel as the final site boundary for the facility. So about 30% of the facilities were drawn in terms of their boundaries using steps 1 through 3. And then for step 4, if the parcel boundaries didn't match the facility boundaries that were in the permitting documents, we selected different or additional parcels to match the facility boundaries that were depicted in the permit. Again, trying to double check between what the parcel data say, what the permit information says, and then to reconcile those. And so, and then finally, if there's no clear depiction of the facility's property boundary in the permit documents, we spent some time online searches and we looked at satellite imagery from Google Earth to visually estimate property boundaries, and we actually manually drew these facility polygons. So in many cases, and not in many cases, but in a few cases, we also had to, particularly for step 5, there were examples where there were some pretty large sites, for example, Edwards, Travis, and Vandenberg Air Force bases and the Naval Air Weapons Station. We had to use rough estimations of the facility boundaries due to their large areas and their irregular borders and a lack of access of official property boundary maps or shapefiles. And in many cases, because some of these sites are very large, we felt that an entire facility polygon for these 4 sites were probably not necessarily appropriate. And so we focused on sort of the waste-specific polygons within the boundary area to represent the subregion of the facility, which would encompass most of the waste storage and processing activity. So here's an example of what I'm talking about in terms of defining hazardous waste boundaries using parcel data. So on your left, you see a facility in the yellow dot, Clean Tech Environmental Inc. And and then you see in the pink is the entire facility boundary. So what we got from DTSC was the yellow dot, and then we were able to use parcels and information from the permitting documents to get a more realistic picture of the property, okay? On the right is a case where you have a facility, this is Dow Chemical, the dot here in yellow. And you see that it spans actually multiple parcels. And so we join this to create a larger facility boundary that more accurately portrayed the actual property boundaries. And then here's an example where, just to show you kind of what I mean by the difference between facility-specific boundaries and waste-specific boundaries. So on the what you see here is the Chevron complex here in Richmond, and the pink represents the entire kind of facility boundary. Okay. But you can see that this is a very huge site, and there are waste-specific activities that occur on this site, and so two of which we outline here in yellow. And so this gives one the flexibility to do areas of analysis and buffer analyses that either take into account the entire property boundary, or that focus very specifically on where the permitted waste processing and storage activities are occurring. And then we used and provided DTSC with what we call information, facility-specific information on characteristics based on associated with the facility, based on a variety of buffer distances. We considered 13 different buffer distances, so 0.1 miles, 0.3 miles, 0.5 miles, 0.75, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 miles. Okay, so again, this provides kind of a nimbleness and flexibility to do by defining different areas of analyses or buffer distances to characterize the different elements, either sensitive land uses or population characteristics or other environmental hazards that are associated with that facility. And again, we provided flexibility so that these buffer distances are drawn both around, you can look at the characteristics of the facility based on the buffer distances around the entire facility property, or you can have, if you want to just look at where the actual waste processing or storage activities are occurring, we've also provided data associated with that facility that is based on the buffer distances from the actual waste activity as shown in yellow. Okay, and then so here's an example on the right. Again, multiple areas of analysis and based on the waste specific boundary of this particular hazardous waste facility, Pacific Science Energetic Materials Company. Okay, so again, really trying to delineate the boundaries, both facility-wide property boundaries, but also enable some the ability to home in on where waste activities are presumed to be occurring within the facility boundary itself. Okay, the other thing that we did, which we think is hopefully going to be quite useful, and again, these data layers have been provided that are facility specific both to DTSC, but we also have a statewide layer that has been shared with CARB on this, is what we call diasymetric mapping. And the goal here is to really improve our estimates of where people are living and located, okay? And we're interested in, this is less of an issue in urban areas, although it can occur in urban areas, for example, where you have a lot of mixed land use and the residential area of a particular census tract, for example, is a tiny corner, okay? But this is more common of an issue in rural areas where census tracts are, the square miles or the square kilometers of a census tract is much larger, and you have fewer people living there. And so instead of assuming that everyone's kind of evenly distributed within a census tract, we use this method to try and better locate where within a census tract where people are actually living, where are the residential areas. So we undertook this process using kind of a three-step method. Again, using residential parcel data shared with us by the California by ARB. We looked at residential parcels within census blocks throughout the entire state. Census block is the smallest census unit available. And we use the population estimates for the census block and block groups from the 2013 through the 2017 American Community Survey, which is kind of the most recent vintage that we had available at the time. And this provides a nice high resolution map of population characteristics across the state. And so our first step was to look at the residential parcels within census blocks, which is the smallest. And we use this as the boundaries of where people are living within each census block in the entire state of California. And so this allows us to cut out places that are open space or where there's where people are not likely to be living, okay? So we were able to apply that to census blocks that accounted for almost 92% of the state's population. We were able to better figure out where they're actually located within census blocks just using this parcel data. And then within census blocks where there were no residential parcels based on the parcel data that we had, we then drew from another data source, which is publicly available, which provides boundaries of building footprints. It's a national data set, and throughout, we use this for California. And we applied this to blocks that contained about the remaining almost 8% of the state's population, okay? So we might not have parcel data, but we saw that there were buildings within that block, and so we can assume that there are people living in these areas because we know from the census data that those blocks do have people that actually live there. So we assume that they're living where those buildings are. And then for the blocks with the remaining 0.3% of the state's population, we didn't have parcel data. We didn't have building footprint data. So for those remaining folks, we did have to assume that they were evenly distributed within the census block. So the result of this Diasymetric mapping technique is a statewide map of populated areas that are downscaled within census blocks to provide a more accurate location of where people are likely to be located. So here's an example of a populated areas that are downscaled within census blocks. So this shows, again, another DTSC facility, regulated facility, the Safety Clean facility in Fresno. These blue lines are the different buffer distances or areas of analysis, okay, emanating from this regulated facility. And then the areas in green represent the populated areas that are included in your analysis, because this is where we know where people are actually located based on this approach to identify where people are actually living. And then you can focus your attention more within, for example, if you're looking at a buffer within 1 mile, okay, when you're adding up your scores, you can do population weighting that better reflects, you know, within your 1 mile buffer where people are actually located. Okay, so that was kind of so we focused on cleaning up and making more precise the facility boundaries for regulated facilities of DTSC. Then we tried to integrate it with a more accurate
Darlo con un mapa más integrado de dónde vive la gente, particularmente en áreas rurales, pero lo hicimos
data, but then also for statewide. We looked at CalEnviro screen scores for 3.0 because that was what was out at the time when we were doing this. And then we also wanted to integrate additional indicators that are not currently included in CalEnviro screen, but that the literature strongly suggests is important to consider in terms of looking at equity analyses within the epidemiological literature and other EJ research. And that we thought could be important indicators to supplement work on these two, 617 and 673 for decision making. So one is looking at indicators of community civic engagement capacity, okay? And so voter turnout is a really strong indicator of that. And we're very fortunate in California that we have actually pretty good non-proprietary data that can allow us to look at voter turnout. And we did this before the 2020 election, but this could be updated to reflect the most recent November 2020 election. And a lot of EJ research really does indicate that civic engagement capacity, particularly as indicated by voter turnout, is predictive of exposures to environmental hazards. So this is why we thought this was something that would be important to consider and supplement. Again, racial and ethnic makeup is another one that is important, and CalEnviro screen was not able to include this indicator in its final version of CalEnviro screen, in part because of restrictions of Proposition 209. However, in this situation where we're talking about permitting decisions and clean air action plans and other kinds of things, I think it would be important to use these indicators as a supplement. Additional hazards that I think are important that are currently not included in CalEnviro screen are the presence of oil and gas wells, both active and new wells. My team has been doing, for a while, you know, California has some of the oldest oil and gas developed industry, as probably several people on this call already know. And for a while, there was a paucity of health studies about the health impacts going on in California. There's been a lot of studies in other parts of the country where fracking has rapidly developed. Our oil and gas infrastructure is actually quite different than that because it has been around for 100 years. But some studies from my team and others have really started to show that that proximity to oil and gas activities in California does pose potential health risks for respiratory outcomes as well as adverse birth outcomes. So we thought that this as kind of another hazard indicator is something that is worth considering when we're looking at cumulative impacts and the presence of other environmental hazards in decision making. The other thing that we think is important in terms of a vulnerability metric is to look at the presence of domestic drinking wells. California is the only state in the country to have a human right to water law. OEHA has been doing amazing work on implementation of California's human right to water law. And so there's been increased attention to drinking water quality and access as a result of this work and the passage of this legislation, and a lot of community engagement to make all this work happen. And one of the big data gaps until recently was we have, you know, decent data on community water systems for those of us who are fortunate enough to be connected to one. But there was a paucity of data for a long time on the location and presence of domestic drinking water wells. And OEHA has done a lot of work to try and characterize places that are not served by community water systems. We feel like it's also very useful to just look, particularly for DTSC, when they're looking at potential impacts of their regulated facilities, figure out the extent to which there's a lot of the presence of domestic drinking water wells, since they are often fall beneath the regulatory radar screen because they do not fall under traditional federal Clean Drinking Water Act and other regulations. And yet this is extremely important source of potential environmental hazard exposure. And then we folded in sensitive land uses. Again, this is an important issue, and CARB's sensitive land use handbook guided a lot of our decision making on this. So looking at senior care facilities, hospitals, childcare, daycare facilities, schools, etc., and parks and playgrounds. But we also wanted to incorporate the locations of prisons. I think this is a very much overlooked sensitive land use, where you have an incarcerated population with very high rates of underlying health conditions, who have absolutely no control in their ability to protect themselves against environmental hazards. And so we thought this is an additional indicator that is worth considering in terms of a vulnerability metric. Okay, so I wanted to just show a little bit about kind of what, how, if you look at when you downscale, for example, Calin-Virus screen scores, which are provided at the census tract level, that and especially when you're doing these areas of analysis work related to DTSC regulated facilities, you can ensure that the populated areas are assigned to the Calin-Virus screen score of the tract that contains them. And you can do population weighting. If you're concerned about population weighting and you don't want to do that, you can just derive what the maximum and minimum Calin-Virus screen score is for the areas within your buffer distance. Okay, so on this map that I'm showing you right now, you have the Safety Clean facility again in Fresno, and this is an area of analysis buffer distance of 2 miles. Okay, and you can see the populated areas with the that are being allocated with the different CES scores, and the black areas are the census tract boundaries. Okay, so you have the flexibility when you're doing your analysis to say, okay, what's the worst case scenario within a 2 mile buffer distance? What's the maximum CEI score that we're seeing? CES score, Calin-Virus screen score that we're seeing, or what's the minimum? And then you could do an overall population weighted estimate of that score. Okay, and so we've provided kind of all of those scenarios affiliated with these facilities, again, to allow for a range of cumulative impacts, taking into account different kinds of assumptions, and so that people can see what the worst case and kind of worst case and lower case and kind of middle case scenario might look like. So the other thing that we wanted to allow for is both area weighting of variables within an area of analysis. So meaning that instead of weighting by the population that are there, if you want to be able to weight by the square miles of the population areas that we created through the Diasymetric mapping, you can do that. So here's an example that we provided where you can derive within this specific area of analysis buffer an area weighted score, just based on a proportion of this buffer distance of area, and then you just weight it by the proportion of this area that is tied to this Callen-Virus green score for each of these pieces within the buffer. So if you do an area weighted CES score within this buffer distance, you're weighting each score by its proportion, and you get a score of 23.5. And again, this is just an example. But if you want to weight it, for example, by population weighting, you can do that as well. It's a little bit more complicated, but again, we've provided the data and also the information for you to compare those different kinds of scores. And here you're weighting by the proportion of the population within each of these pieces of the same buffer, and you do get a slightly different score, just so you can kind of see what you end up with. Okay, the other thing that we've done is this is looking at oil and gas wells. Again, we feel like this is an important hazard that really probably should be considered given the ubiquity of oil and gas operations, particularly in highly impacted regions like the San Joaquin Valley, Los Angeles, and the Central Coast. So here's an example where, you know, we're looking at a facility, and then you can see the density or the counts of new and active oil and gas wells within a 5-mile buffer distance, in this case of the Clean Harbors facility in Buttonwillow. And so we count these sensitive land uses within each area of analysis, and we also provide sort of a disaggregated count of these sensitive land uses and or these hazards. We also, for the sensitive land uses like parks, hospitals, senior centers, other kinds of things, we provide a total sensitive land use count as well. So you can look at them all together, or you can look at them in their categories. This is looking at domestic well counts. The domestic well data is a little tricky. This is for another project, but we are trying to, oftentimes the domestic well data is not available as necessarily as an individual point source, but you get these, what are called these sections, and then they tell you that within this section there are this many wells. So we don't necessarily have precise estimate of where these wells are, although we are undertaking a project for a different grant right now to see if we can improve our location of wells. But based on the data that we have had at the time, we look at domestic well sections so you can get a sense here in terms of the safety clean facility. You can get a sense of the domestic well density within a buffer distance of this facility. So this could give you an indication of the potential, whether or not there's concerns about potential threats to people's drinking water quality or drinking water contamination, if that's an issue with a particular facility. And then we intersect that with where people are actually living, because there are some wells that have been in existence for a really long time. Some of them are no longer used. So you can also focus on areas where that you have high domestic well density and where it's clear that there are people living there who are likely dependent upon them. Okay, so these are examples, and the report is super dense. I don't have time to show kind of all the different data sources and maps. I could probably take about 2 hours just to do that. Sort of all this data and mapping work, and then the data sets that we have provided and both that are facility specific for DTSC, but then are also statewide data layers for people who just want to play with the data in general. Based on a lot of our analysis, we have some kind of recommendations for enhancing cumulative impacts analysis. So the first one is we really encourage both CARB and DTSC to integrate data related to oil and gas production to supplement cumulative impacts metrics and add this additional environmental hazard metric to the mix. Increasingly, health studies in California are definitely showing that this is something that's important to consider, given the impact of the oil and gas industry, both on air quality, drinking water quality, noise, and a lot of the other sources that are associated with them. We think this is a hazard that should be considered, particularly in areas that are that are the epicenters of oil and gas production in California. San Joaquin, LA, and Central Coast in particular. The other thing is, we think there's opportunities to enhance information on sensitive land uses, and that can incorporate more information on the location of domestic drinking water wells. And we've provided the data to do that. And if we are able to even make it sharper in the future based on this other project we're working on, we will be more than happy to share it. We try and put up a lot of this stuff online. And we think that CalEnviro screening can be supplemented with additional sensitive land use indicators. So in addition to things that align with CARB's sensitive land use handbook, like park, schools, child care facilities, health care and senior care facilities, we think that prisons should be added to the mix. And the importance of integrating additional indicators of civic engagement capacity that and racial and ethnic composition. And so we think adding racial and ethnic composition and voter turnout would be kind of low pieces of hanging fruit to do that. And then we really encourage both agencies to use the work that we've done to improve the location of where people actually live in many of these communities throughout the state. And specifically for DTSC, we think that the data layer that we've provided has improved the locational accuracy of the sites, and that in the future, as new facilities come on and offline, that these public use data sets, could sort of proactively provide accurate information about where the facility boundaries are, and then where the boundaries are of the hazardous waste processing and storage activities, just to make it easier going forward for people who are doing cumulative impacts analysis. And then also just, do a lot of sensitivity analysis when assessing the cumulative impacts associated with hazardous waste facilities and nearby environmental hazards, vulnerable populations, and sensitive land uses, so that you can get a range of worst case scenario and somewhere in the middle, and provide a little bit more transparency related to the uncertainties related to the cumulative impacts analysis, and have a more kind of transparent discussion about regulation and facility and permitting decision making based on the results of that. So that's it. I am the last one, and I just wanted to thank our amazing team. There were a lot of people that are not here today that worked really hard on this, and they are listed here. A lot of amazing graduate students, postdocs, research scientists. So you can see all their names here. And then the incredibly productive and useful feedback we got from staff at CARB, DTSC, OEHA, and our environmental justice collaborators who gave us a lot of great input and key critique at timely opportunities throughout. So I just want to thank you and open it up to questions.
Hi, thank you, Rachel, so much for a great presentation. And we have one hands up. That's Deldy, and I'm not sure if that was left from your last question, Deldy, or you have any questions for Rachel. And she took it out.
That was a holdover, but thank you, Rachel. Great presentation.
Thanks, Deldy.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll start with some of the questions that we've received so far. it seems like it may be relevant to identify locations of both the air emissions and waste handling and disposal at facilities to consider cumulative impacts.
So so the emission stuff, I think some of that stuff is, we were trying to look for indicators and improve, like, sorry, let me back up. My brain is my brain's going faster than my mouth. Let me back up. So CalEnviroScreen has some useful information on the location of a lot of these facilities. It also has information on air quality indicators. And so what we were trying to do here, and what DTSC really wanted us to do, is to link both CalEnviroScreen indicators that get at some of the things that you just mentioned here, and then add additional indicators that are not currently included in CalEnviroScreen to enhance the capacity to do a deeper dive on cumulative impacts analysis, which is what we try to do. So each one of these facilities has the results for both CalEnviroScreen indicators as well as scores, as well as the additional indicators that are not included there at all the different buffer distances, both for the entire facility boundary and for the waste specific
población, desde la instalación en general y la instalación en concreto dentro de la propiedad que hace el manejo de desechos peligrosos. Creo que espero haber contestado su pregunta. Gracias.
It was, let's see, Sally. So let us know if Rich didn't answer the question.
Era Sani, si no hemos respondido a la pregunta, me lo dicen. Tenemos un comentario de la señora Margaret, que ha dicho que está de acuerdo con que hay que incluirla.
She says, when will the report on this work be publicly available? And we need to just provide the link, and it will be provided with as well as the recording, and it will be sent to everybody who registered, and we'll make an announcement as well. And it says, thank you so much for this informative presentation and the efforts to focus on where people are actually living. Given where people work may be near hazards too, are there any novel methods to capture that? It seems like the novel method to carve out the non-residential parcel can be helpful to hone the residential piece, but then may incidentally carve out places where people work and spend substantial time.
Yeah, so that's a really important issue. What we really tried to do was, again, because we use the building footprint data, we assumed that where there was a building footprint, regardless of what kind of print it was, that there were people there. So unfortunately, there's not really good data available for us to know exactly where people work versus where they live. We have much better data in terms of where people live. But I think that by folding in some of the building footprint data, we had the parcel data, which is focused on residential, and then we have the building footprint data, which is not necessarily specific to residential. But we assumed that within those blocks that there were people there. So the goal was to get rid of kind of open space and areas where it's unlikely, people are hanging out very much. But I think that is a limit. There's still a little bit of a limitation there that you're lifting up, which I think is a valid one, and something that I think going forward we need to figure out how to try and address. But without good information on where people are working, that's a bigger challenge.
We have a hand raised. Ms. Marguerite has raised her hand.
Yes, because hello everybody. Ms. Margaret Gordon with the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project. Cal Enviro screening does not include the incarcerated, the homeless, low-wage workers, and the homeless. And those are very impacted and vulnerable constituency and community. Until we have all those are vulnerable to not having a well meeting, Cal Enviro is missing in action. And we have to move forward and expediting that Cal Enviro put these individual categories inside of and find those sites of those categories to be included into the guiding principles. Because right now, we just talking about it. We have nothing, there's nothing to say that they will actually do anything for that constituency or for that category of people. So there's still a missing link in the communication, the messaging, the public health, and the legislation to be more including, to look at equity for this category of category that I'm talking about. So we need to be asking those on this webinar or on this session, what is the mechanism to be more including in them, even and also including on the AB 617. All right, how do either cardboard, carb staff, or the legislation start, and the Office of Research make a more robust process of have more fact-finding evidence to be more including of this category of people.
Yeah, well, I don't know the answer to your direct question, Ms. Margaret, because I'm not on the cardboard, but I think our strategy right now was to say, you know, here's some data. We spent a lot of time mapping it. We actually think it's good data, and for now, it can be used as a supplement, and hopefully, you know, now that we've provided these data layers and that, you know, it could, you know, sometimes by showing that this data is good, it could be, then the next conversation can be, you know, how can we integrate this and enhance some of our vulnerability metrics and add these? To what extent you know, does it make sense to actually fold it into Cal Enviro screen? But
we need, okay, but right now we have the Office of OPR. We have Delty on the phone, Delty on here, and I think other people, other agency people here. We need to have them to speak up how they will be more including this messaging, this conversation, to look for actions and activities to be more including. Because this is until we're able to really fine tune equity for all who have impact. We just this is a lot of lip service. So we need to hear from. For me, I need to hear from those who have the ability to be more including this conversation, to recognize that these people, that these constituencies need to be have more equity as part of policy to ensure that they have all those things that give them the outcomes of being healthy. And that's why I need to hear from those on this telephone call through the host. How are ask that question? What can they do? What can they do or they can't do? Are they not able to do to be more supportive of putting this in the forefront?
Miss Margaret, unfortunately, I'm looking for Deldy, and I think she had to probably jump off the call.
But who else is on here from ARB has in a position to have a discussion about a dialogue or conversation on this issue?
So I see Crystal.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I was chewing. I'm here. So I'm part of CARB's EJ unit, and I'm
Speak
new
up, honey. Speak up.
Sorry, let me turn me up. Sorry. Hi, Miss Margaret. I'm not Deldy, obviously. Sorry. I'm newish to CARB. I think I know some of you, but not all of you. I'm part of CARB's EJ unit, and under Chanel Fletcher, we're beginning to talk about how we're going to structure capacity building trainings and build equity in a more meaningful way into the regulations and other processes throughout CARB. So that's definitely a goal, but I know Chanel and Deldy very much value your opinion, Miss Margaret, and are already in conversations with you about how to do this, and I'm not a substitute for them, but I'm here and I'm listening to take this in. So appreciate all of this today.
But I'm being very specific. Homeless, incarcerated, farm workers, and low-income workers. That's what I need for you to answer the question: how are you going to translate or communicate those four areas back to them?
And those are some of the hardest to reach people. So, I mean, I think there's language access issues and there's just access issues. People experiencing homelessness are hard to find and hard to reach. And it takes a different approach. I agree. It's really hard. I don't think it's something that CARB has done a lot of. And I think CARB really needs to change and think critically about how it does engagement and change what it's been doing into a different way, or build deeper avenues and pathways into those four groups you just mentioned. I don't have a lot of answers right now, other than I think I agree with you, that's really important. And I welcome, this conversation or others to talk about how to do this structurally, but I don't think CARB does an excellent job at that yet, I will say.
If I can, so we've been having the similar conversations on the WEJAC right now because of the goals to create a climate and economic justice screening tool nationally. And so the issue of unhoused folks in terms of accurately locating them is a huge challenge right now. The issue of farm workers and other occupational groups, we've been trying to see if we can get, for example, better data on farm worker, a minimum, like start somewhere, like something is better than nothing, to locate farm worker housing locations as one starting point, even though we know that it doesn't reflect like where people are at when they're in the fields, but to at least start somewhere to try and get some representation of those groups. Anything as when we find out and hear from USDA and HUD that has that information, we can kind of see what that data looks like. I'd be more than happy to share it and figure out a way to whether or not it's feasible to fold that in as well as another vulnerable population in addition to the incarcerated.
Have you ever heard of Cesar Chavez?
Yes.
Okay. Didn't he develop an organization?
Yes.
Why is they not part of this to be answer that question?
Yeah. I think because it has just not been successful at ensuring appropriate regulation to protect that population.
But there's also the question of just having the conversation with them.
Yes.
They have a lot of reform imprisonment programs. There's a lot of groups out there doing fighting for 15. Why are they not here asking the question?
I agree with you.
Yeah, I think we need to make I think this is this research study, and what Rachel is bringing up is definitely, and what you're bringing up is definitely areas that we need to work on and focus more. Like Christelle said, I think this recording is, it's being recorded. I'm sure that I can tell you, Miss Marguerite, that a lot of people have had conflicts, but I assured them that this was going to be recorded and we're going to send it. We had to sign up for, if interest of this this seminar of close to 500 people. And roughly about half of them were able to come, and that includes, unfortunately, our management as well. But I'm sure that those of us who are from ARB, we will be making sure they get your concerns, and we'll be working on this.
So, and I would definitely love to have more of a conversation about how to have additional data sources, because we are immersed in these conversations at the federal level, and the extent to which that work can inform us how we can do better here, I would love to continue that.
Rachel, can you just email me or call me?
Yes. Yes, ma'am, I will do that.
Yeah, and I can tell you, I got 4 or 5, I got 3 to 4 groups within, just in Oakland, that can answer some of these questions, and will be maybe willing to sit down and have this conversation.
Okay.
Great. So we've gone over 10 minutes. So I'm opening it up for any questions. And at this point, we have about 15 minutes or a little bit less. And I would like people to maybe ask the question directly, if you could raise your hands. If not, I'll continue with the questions we have. I've copied all the questions, and I'll be sending them to the investigators and to CARB staff, and we'll try to do our best to address them. So please, hopefully you can unmute yourself and ask the questions in person.
We have one from Ginger Wireman.
Yeah, I'm actually up in Washington, and we just passed an EJ rule in the agency. I work for the Washington State Department of Ecology, so that's why I'm on your call today to learn, since I think you guys are farther along on this. And I'm wondering, I think, Rachel, you were talking about current sites, and I'm wondering where the overlap then is on like Superfund or Cal Superfund, I don't know what you call them, cleanup sites. Is there like a whole nother layer that you're using this type of work with?
Well, again, we were trying not to duplicate what Cal EnviroScreen currently has in it. The goal was to say, based on what Cal EnviroScreen has, what are some additional indicators and available data that we could use to supplement and enhance the kinds of hazard and vulnerability indicators that Cal EnviroScreen already does. Okay. So that was kind of the premise, the starting point. And then how can we link that up to the work that DTSC is trying to do in terms of its cumulative impacts analysis of the facilities it hazardous waste facilities it regulates, and then how can we provide those data layers to ARB, particularly OCAP and others, to inform what they're doing, and also make this, as we've done before when we had this another CARB funded project before CalEnviroScreen was our environmental justice screening method, which CARB helped us launch. And then we provided those data layers to ARB, and others were able to use them. And then Cal EPA was great enough to take it over, and now we have CalEnviroScreen. So now it's like, how do we supplement CalEnviroScreen to start accounting for other things that aren't currently in there?
Thank you.
I know there's a lot of questions. So please let me know if you see any hands, but I'm going to start from the bottom up this time, so that I don't duplicate the questions. So we have a comment here that we need more Miss Marguerite Gordons, and I think we'll all agree. Jonathan mentioned that he appreciates the discussion of the prisons and gave some internet, some links.
Y algunos enlaces para algunas personas que puede ser de bastante utilidad. Y también
Miss Marguerite's comment and the question, this is Ginger, and Mr. Lamb's asked are very compelling. I'm actually up in, oh, that's you. That's Ginger. So Ginger already mentioned it. Okay. Sorry about that. Jim says, how will the hazardous waste facilities analysis help legislators with reducing upstream toxic waste? This shift the focus from not generating these emissions and leaks rather than shifting to buffers. I don't know if you want to comment.
Well, I think, again, like I think one of the key elements of this project was, DTSC is been undertaking their strategy to do cumulative impacts analysis with the facilities that they regulate to inform decision making going forward. So, we really wanted to provide them with a robust data source and indicators for which they could do that. But we, how they choose to approach that in their decision making, I think that's going to be more a question for them.
So we have here, how is groundwater contamination evaluated by DTSC? Is it at the site boundary, or do you address actual contaminant plume?
I don't know, is there somebody from DTSC on here who would like to answer that question?
But I think maybe it also is pertinent to you. Do you include the plume in your water? No, right? Analysis?
No, well, so we have not, what we provided in this data set was just the presence of domestic wells that we believe people are using for drinking water. CalEnviroScreen does have estimates of drinking water quality, so that we did not want to replicate their all of their great work on their drinking water quality layer. And so I think interest in drinking water quality issues can be looked at separately through CalEnviroScreen, because the water quality affects both wells and community water systems. The only issue is that we know less about the drinking water quality for wells because they're not required to test. And we also thought that the density of drinking water wells is an important thing to take into account, just because they're not regulated, and you can, it's a uniquely vulnerable community if their potential drinking water sources are threatened.
Thanks. Here's a question for Jonathan. Was there any difference in satisfaction between district-led community steering committees and those with community co-leads?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we did see some pattern in greater satisfaction in places that were co-led, particularly satisfaction by community residents and the community organizations. Our sample size was a little small, so to be able to say, definitively there's a, statistical relationship, we can't do that. But qualitatively, we did see that, and in the quotes in the interviews, we definitely saw evidence of that. And I should say also in our participant observation, in the meetings themselves, there seemed to be much greater sort of positive interactions and a positive kind of mood, really, in the room in places that were community led.
Thank you. Here's another question for you, Jonathan. Ronald says, great presentation. Do you have a way of thinking about how to take these collective lessons from the 15 sites and improve the air for everyone?
Yeah, I know. I saw that one. I'm trying to think about it, how to answer that. I mean, in some ways, the factors in my show there, the factors that facilitate and challenge success is sort of a way to synthesize that. I mean, I do think that, developing strategies to move that continuum or the CSCs on that continuum to a greater level of community power and community leadership is crucial. I think that capacity building at all levels is crucial. Capacity around is dealing with cultural diversity, environmental justice, racial justice. That really is in the beginning stages and is going to need to be significantly improved to expand. And I think, I really think that now the questions of implementation come to the fore. Process continues to be important, but we really need to see now what are the measures that are being implemented, how are the budget, resources being allocated, and then ultimately, what are the impacts. So I think the shift in attention needs to move to that scale of implementation and impact.
Thank you. Here's a general question on the CES, and is, I guess for Rachel, can weighting of factors in assessment of hazard be changed according to the local conditions, or could that be too messy?
Yeah, I think, Calum Virus Screen made a decision, the assumption is that there are multiplicative effects, which I think is definitely supported by the scientific literature, but when they're doing the cumulative score. But I don't think there's like consistent and definitive guidance, particularly as you expand the scope of indicators of how you would weight it a priori. That said, both Calum Virus Screen and the data that we provided allow you to look at the different indicators alone. You can download the data and you can look at the different layers depending on what you want to focus on. So I agree with the question that it gets complicated, and I'm not sure it's worth going down that rabbit hole because there is not any really kind of scientific consensus about how you would weight these indicators a priori. But I think it's important to be able to look at the cumulative scores, but then also be able to peel it like an onion and see kind of what are some of the things that are really driving. If you have a place where you have very high scores, whether it's just Calum Virus Screen or whether it's Calum Virus Screen score supplemented by some other things, you want to see kind of what are the main drivers of what those cumulative results look like, because that'll give you a sense of what's important and also can give you a sense of where you might want to be intervening and engaging with community stakeholders on, and also ground truthing what you're seeing to see whether or not it reflects what communities are actually seeing on the ground.
Thank you. Here's a question that is related to that question, which is question about coronavirus screen. How does data from quality air monitors get transferred to coronavirus screen for real-time updates? Well, they don't. But I guess maybe the question is, again, going to that rabbit hole.
Well, John Faust is on the call, so they're just finishing 4.0. So I don't know, John, do you want to say anything about that, or?
Yeah, hi, Rachel, thank you. I mean, I could say a little bit, and I was actually just typing a note that I'm offering to let anyone who has questions about Callan virus screen and how we handle data and where there might be opportunities for improvement to get in touch with us, either me or through our general email. But yeah, basically, you know, the Callan virus screen data set is a snapshot. It's sort of designed to capture conditions as they are for the most recent data that we have. We don't currently have the ability to sort of incorporate live data that are basically fed into Callan virus screen and are updated continuously. You know, that would be a dream, but it's currently not the reality of how the tool is made. I don't know if there's anything else I can help with on that.
I was just going to say that, like, this is a general challenge of creating these spatial tools in general. They're meant to reflect a snapshot in time and kind of an average about what's going on, and you update them periodically, but they're not conducive to real time or acute events necessarily. That's their limitations in general, whether you're talking about Callan virus screen or any other kind of tool. Sorry, John.
Oh, no, that's totally fine. Thank you. So I pasted our contact information in the chat if anyone wants to follow up with me or with the program folks.
Thank you, Jonathan, for doing that. Not Jonathan, John. Sorry. So here's a question. It says, great presentation, great comments. This is Lois Smith. Curious if there has been any exploration among the agencies of the structural system that are influencing communication and work between the groups. It's a pretty good question. I think everybody could answer that one.
So if the question is about the groups being like the community stakeholder committees or steering committees, CSCs.
No.
So yeah, so there, you know, as I say, we did have this convening back in a year ago, February, and we're looking into a future one. I'm not sure that there's a, well, I don't think that there's a sort of an independent or CARB or district-based process for linking those groups. I think the advocacy EJ community is doing a lot of that. I know particularly familiar with that in the Central Valley. They've got 4 sites now, and there's a lot of co-training and you know, orienting the newer sites based on the experience that the earlier sites have. And I believe that's happening in other places. I know Miss Margaret is on the speakers circuit a lot with the other sites. So there's that happening kind of from the grassroots level. But I'm not familiar with that at the agency, state agency level and at the, you know, at the air district level. But I think it's a really valuable thing to do.
Anybody else? Here we have a question from Miss Margaret. She says, the one more missing link is the history behind the FHUD and the FHA redlining planners, planning, transportation planners, agriculture, investment, zoning, land use, placement people, and public health. And that's a summarized it in very concise.
Good comment. And, you know, I put in the chat Richard Rothstein's book, Color of Law, and then Deldy had put in this really fantastic website that she and a big group of other agency leaders have created, Pollution and Prejudice, that looks at the relationship between redlining and environmental justice today. They have these, it's a whole narrative. Then they also look at what were called the HOLC maps, Homeowner Loan Corporation. What was the
Yep.
C?
Homeowner Loan Corporation, yes.
Corporation, yeah. So that, though, they had, anyway, not to go into huge detail, but those are the maps that created redlining, places that had greater proportion of people of color and immigrants and low-income people were rated red, therefore not to be invested in for home and business mortgages. So creating this sort of fulfilling prophecy of blight, which then led to urban renewal and destruction of those communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And today we have, you know, these kinds of inequitable economic and environmental conditions in these same communities. So that website is great. It's up on the link in the chat. So I would definitely encourage people to look at that. And that is the federal, you know, housing, you know, federal housing loan programs that Ms. Margaret was referring to.
Yeah, we have a few studies that have come out looking at redlining. We've looked at redlining and poor birth outcomes and fetal deaths in California. We've looked at redlining and asthma exacerbations, and we've looked at redlining associated with green space nationally. And we're currently working on another one looking at redlining and segregation in relationship to different kinds of air pollution. So stay tuned for that one. That's not associated with this project, but these redlining maps have recently become available online and they're digitized. So a lot of people are, it's really nice that a lot of environmental health people are starting to leverage them to look at environmental justice questions, to look at how legacies of a racist policy that happened over 80 years ago is still exerting its influence on our environments today.
Thank you. So I'm going to take one last question. I don't see any hands. And then I'm going to wrap it up and because we're gone a little bit over time. So I'm wondering if the results of screening risk assessments performed by toxic emitting industrial facilities can be fed into a Cullen virus screen to more accurately map the spatial impacts of these emissions.
I don't know. I'm not sure I totally understand the question, so I'm a little reluctant to answer it off the fly.
I think what I'm getting, and Errol, if you're still there, maybe you can chime in. Yeah, he's unmuted, so he can ask the question.
Ever since the Toxic Hotspot Act was passed in 1998, industrial facilities of a certain emission level are required to quantify their emissions of toxic pollutants. And if those exceed a certain level, then they're required to do health risk assessments of the health risks downwind of their facilities. Those analyses provide very specific maps of areas that are impacted with increased cancer risks, acute and chronic health impacts, and they're much more spatially defined than what appears to be, from my use of Cullen virus screen, the current method, which is just to identify toxic emitting facilities either within or near to each census tract, and maybe count up the numbers of those to assign a score to each census tract.
Yeah, I guess I'll let John answer this question. I mean, they do have an indicator looking at toxic releases from facilities, and I don't know if you've looked at the 4.0 version, but John, did you want to add anything? I'm reluctant.
Yeah, I mean, that is right. We do have, as you said, the emissions from the larger facilities that are incorporated, including the modeling of the dispersion of those pollutants. It takes into account stack height and meteorology and so forth. We do have an interest in including some of these smaller emitting facilities, but currently, much of the data for the smaller facilities is a bit inconsistent across the state. We do, for example, fold in certain other facilities, like, for this version of Catalan virus screen, we incorporated, or I should say proposed to incorporate chrome plating facilities, for example, which are known emitters of rather significant and toxic compounds. So, there are ways that we can start to fold in some of this information when we do have, statewide consistent data sets, but it's something of a slow process.
Well, thank you for answering that question, John. And that said, I'm going to thank all the presenters and everybody who has hung in there for the basically 3 hours and marathon. And, I know how much work the investigators have put into this, and I really do appreciate it. I thank you so much. It seems that Errol has his hand raising. No? Okay. All right. So thank you so much. And I really appreciate it. And it was a great seminar. And this will be hopefully available for other people, and it will continue to be useful for others as well. Thank you so much for everybody.
Thank you all. Great questions. I really appreciate the discussion.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.